Good morning children. Today we are here to study about the first part of control and coordination, that is control and coordination in animals. So welcome to the chapter children. So in your last chapter you have already studied about the functional processes in your body. So when you started the chapter there was a discussion on how will you identify living organisms from non-living organisms. And I'm sure most of you would have answered with a life being associated with movements. Now, generally we say that it is living organisms that move. And why do they move? Generally we say that it is in response to a change in their environment, which we call as stimuli. So we have seen there are different types of stimuli in the environment like heat, cold, sound, smell, taste, touch, pressure, gravity, water. So there are so many different types of stimuli to which living organisms respond. Now you have also seen that when our body shows these movements in response to the stimuli, there must be some factor in our body which must be deciding what type of response to be shown, because all the stimuli are not similar and they are different types of stimuli and we show different types of responses. So the organs that are working in our body or functioning in our body, you have studied about the different systems like the digestive system, the excretory system, the respiratory system, the circulatory system. So you are seeing that all of them function in the body for us to be able to respond to the environment. So this working together of the different organs in our body in order for us to provide a proper response to stimulus is called as coordination. So in this chapter we will be studying how control and coordination is done by the nervous system and the endocrine system in case of animals, and in plants, since they do not have any endocrine system, they do not have a nervous system, this function is done by the endocrine system or the plant hormones. So in this first part we will be discussing animal nervous system and coordination. So in animals, you know that control and coordination is generally done by our nervous system and it is supported by the endocrine system. Now if you consider the nervous system, it consists of different parts like the brain, the spinal cord, nerves and the sense organs. Now sense organs are also an integral part of our nervous system because they are the ones that connect us to the outside environment. The stimuli in the outside environment is seen by them or it is received by them, and these messages are then passed on to the brain or the spinal cord for processing and to decide what type of response we should show. Now this is just a small example to show you how coordination is done by brain. So suppose we come across a stimulus which is sound in the form of a telephone ringing. So our sense organs, the ears, they will receive this stimulus of sound and pass the message on to the brain. The brain analyzes the sound and identifies it as the ring of the phone, and it guides our muscles to pick up the phone. So here the organs that will do the action, they are called as effectors. So here our effectors are the muscles. And what response the muscles will do, that is the response, or what activity the muscles will do will be the response. So here the response will be picking up the phone. So we see that movement is always based on the type of stimuli which differs from one stimulus to another. Now the functional units of the nervous system which make all this possible is the neuron. So you have studied about neurons in your lower classes. You are quite familiar with the structure of the neuron that is shown here. So we know that our nervous system is made up of millions of neurons, and generally a nerve that we talk about in our nervous system contains a bundle of nerve cells. Okay, each nerve cell is called as a neuron and their function is to transmit electrical messages which are called as impulses. Now how does the impulse travel across a neuron? The impulse is received by the short processes of the neuron that we call as dendrites. Now the dendrites pass this message to the central cell body or the cyton. From there again this is transmitted to the long process, that is the axon. The axon has terminal small button-like structures that are called as axon terminals, and through this axon terminals the message is passed on to the next neuron. Then in the axon you can see the myelin sheath, which is the fatty covering that are seen at regular intervals on the axon. It helps in speeding up the transport of the impulse. So structure of neuron, children, you are already familiar with. Now what happens when the impulse reaches the tip of the axon? So when it reaches the axonal endings, now it is not directly connected to the next neuron, okay, or the dendrite of the next neuron. There is a small gap between this axonal ending and the dendrite of the next neuron, which we call as synapse. So this synapse is filled with a fluid that is called as synaptic fluid, and we need the message to be transferred from the pre-neuron to the post-neuron, that is from the neuron which is bringing the message to the neuron which has to receive the message. So for this, there are some specialized chemicals that are called as neurotransmitters, which are produced by vesicles in the axonal endings. So these neurotransmitters, they are released into the synaptic gap, and these neurotransmitters, they will move from the pre-axon to the post-axon, where it will attach to receptors on the surface of the dendrite and thus pass on the message to the next neuron. So this is how the gap between two neurons, transmission of impulse will take place. Now we will familiarize ourselves with some terms that we have been using or will be using in this chapter. The first one was, we talked about receptors in the first example, where you saw that the sense organ was portrayed as the receptor. So receptors are actually specialized tips of nerve cells which are capable of receiving stimuli and passing this to the brain or the spinal cord with the help of nerves. So there are different types of receptors in our body depending on the particular stimuli that we have to detect. For example, in the eyes there are photoreceptors which will help in detecting light. In the ears there are phonoreceptors that help in detecting sound. In the nose we have olfactory receptors which will detect smell. In our tongue we have gustatory receptors which will detect taste. Then in the skin we have some receptors called tango receptors which will help us to detect touch. In addition, we also have some thermoreceptors in our skin which can detect heat. Now, the action taken. Who takes the action? The action is taken by effectors. So, what are effectors? Effectors are the muscles and glands which respond to the information from the brain and spinal cord through the motor nerves. Okay. Then we come to what is response. Now, response is what is the behavior we show in whenever we come across a stimuli that we say or that we call as a response. For example, when you touch a hot object, immediately you will pull your hand away. So this pulling your hand away is actually the response that you show to the stimulus of heat. Now all these are connected with the help of some nerve fibers, which are the sensory nerves and the motor nerves. Now sensory nerves, from the term sensory nerves, you can understand that these are nerves that will be coming from the sense organs. So they carry information from the sense organs to the brain and the spinal cord. Whereas motor nerves, motor is associated with action. So wherever action is required, that is the muscles and the gland, the messages transmitted to them by these nerves are called as motor nerves. Now, this is just a slide of the types of neurons and their pathway. You can see the message starts with the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron send the message to the brain and spinal cord, which contains some specialized type of neurons that are called as interneurons. These interneurons act as the processing centers. Then from the interneurons, the message is passed through the muscles with the help of motor neurons. Okay. Then sometimes we do respond without thinking. Okay, there are many conditions or many situations when suddenly you react without even thinking about it. Okay, so such type of actions we call as reflex action. It is actually a sudden, unconscious and involuntary response. Sudden because it happens suddenly, and unconscious because we are not thinking of it, and involuntary is we are not thinking about the action we are going to do, but automatically it is done. Okay, and example for this again, if you touch something hot, before you think that it is hot and you have to lift your hand, you would have already lifted your hand. So sometimes emergency conditions arise in our body when we have to respond quickly. Normally a response depends on the thinking part of the brain. When the sensory neurons will take the message of the stimulus to the brain, in the frontal part of the brain, the thinking centers are present where this stimuli is analyzed and it is compared with past experiences and a course of action is decided, the message of which is passed through to the muscles or the glands with the help of motor nerves. But this involves time. So for sudden reactions, we cannot depend on this processing taking place in the brain. So instead of that, what happens is that this processing takes place in the spinal cord, because spinal cord is the first place where these nerves will come and join before going on towards the brain. So for sudden conditions or for emergency conditions, the decisions are taken in the spinal cord itself, the cluster of interneurons that are present in the spinal cord. Even though the message will be passed to the brain, you do realize what happens because the message does reach the brain, but the action is not involving the brain. Action is taken because of the processing in the spinal cord. So here is an example, or here is the pathway through which this reflex action is done, and I have an animation here which will show you the movement of the impulse. So here you can see a person touches a hot object. The message is transferred from the tips of the sensory neurons to the spinal cord, and in the spinal cord the interneurons process this information and the message to lift the hand is passed back to the motor neurons, and in this way the motor neurons will help in lifting the hand and protecting one from the heat. So that was about reflex action. So the reflex arc is the pathway. The pathway through which this impulse transmission will take place is called as the reflex arc. So it starts with the stimulus, as I told you, which is the heat, and then it is followed by the receptors receiving it, the sensory neurons transporting it, and then finally the information from the spinal cord comes back to the through the motor nerves. It will come back to the hand and then the hand will be lifted. Okay. Now we'll talk about our human nervous system. So the human nervous system consists of two parts, that is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and this is the main center of control and coordination, brain and the spinal cord. Now to assist the brain and spinal cord and to connect it with the other body organs, we have another system that is called as the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system generally consists of all the nerves that arise from the base of the brain that are called as cranial nerves, and the nerves that arise from the spines that are called as the spinal nerves, and it helps in connecting the rest of the body with the brain and the spinal cord. Now we will discuss about our brain. So as we told, our brain is the most important part of our body. It is the main coordinating center and it is made of millions of neurons. So in class 9th, when you studied tissues, you may have studied that the neurons are cells which do not have the capacity of regeneration. So once it is damaged, it cannot be regenerated. So that is why the brain is given extra protection in the form of a bony covering that is called as the cranium or the skull. Now inside the skull, the brain is again covered by three protective membranes that are called as meninges, in between which there is a fluid that is called as the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid, it protects our brain from shocks, and it also helps in transport between the tissues, brain tissues. So if you consider the parts of our brain has mainly three parts, that is the forebrain, the midbrain and the hindbrain. The forebrain is the part that is seen in front, that is the upper part, okay. Then midbrain is there in the middle and hindbrain is generally seen towards the back. Now forebrain forms the larger part of the brain and it consists of two hemispheres, okay, two hemispheres which are called as the cerebrum, alright. Then along with the cerebrum at the base there are olfactory lobes also. Now the cerebrum is very important because it is the thinking part of our brain and it is the part of the brain that helps in controlling voluntary actions. Okay. So it controls many activities like touch, smell, hearing, taste, sight, many activities like thinking, learning, memory. It is also a seat of our emotions. It also contains the two important endocrine organs, that is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Okay. Now coming to the midbrain. Now midbrain is a small part that is seen just below the forebrain, and it is mainly involved in controlling our involuntary actions, the reflex movements are head, neck and eyes, and also coordinating vision and hearing. The third part, that is the hind part, that is seen at the base of the brain and which continues with our spinal cord, consists of three parts, that is the cerebellum, the pons and the medulla. Now cerebellum, it looks like a miniature cerebrum, but it is smaller, and its main functions are it controls our balance and posture and our body movement. So you are able to cycle, you are able to walk, you are able to maintain your sitting posture and not fall down while you are sitting or walking or running just because of your cerebellum. Now the other two parts that are very important to us in the hindbrain is the pons and medulla, because they are the seat of many vital activities like pons controls respiration, medulla it controls our heartbeat, it controls our blood pressure, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, vomiting, etc. Okay. So many of the emotions that you feel, okay, are controlled by our forebrain. For example, suppose if you finish eating and then you don't want to eat further, this feeling of fullness in you is also because of the forebrain, because the centers for hunger is there in the forebrain. So it will help you realize that you cannot eat more. Okay. So midbrain and hindbrain, they are generally concerned with the other activities. So these are the different parts of the brain. So here you can see a picture of the brain, okay, with its different layers. This upper convoluted structure that you see here, that is the cerebrum. The base of the cerebrum, you have the important pituitary glands, and in between you have the midbrain. Then below the midbrain you have the three parts of the hindbrain. Now the hindbrain is again continued downwards. The medulla is then again continued downwards as the spinal cord. So the spinal cord starts from the base of the brain and it extends up through our vertebral column, or it passes through the central cavity of our vertebral column. The spinal cord is just like a mediator between the brain and the different tissues of our body. It carries messages to and fro from the brain, that's what I said, it connects the body parts with the spinal cord, and it also controls our reflex actions. Now the brain and the spinal cord are specifically protected with the help of bony structures that are called as cranium and vertebral column. The cranium is the bony box which is otherwise called as the skull that protects the brain, and inside this our brain is present. And it is almost like a fluid filled balloon, because again it contains the cerebrospinal fluid also, which protects shock absorption. The vertebral column provides the space for the spinal cord. There also the cerebrospinal fluid is present. It acts as shock absorber there also, and also helps in transport. So this is about coordination in animals, children. So coordination in plants we'll be seeing in the second part. Thank you.